from the 1890s, and those with keen eyes can see that there's no Sydney Airport runways on it. There's no Port Botany jutting out into the bay. And you might also notice that the Cooks River comes out into the bay at a different place to where it does today. These are pretty huge differences to what we know today, but they're only the latest and by no means largest changes to the shore of the bay over many thousands of years. And it's these ancient changes I'd like to talk about today. In doing so, I'm going to touch on some aspects of the long and continuing Aboriginal history of the bay also, but I do so from the perspective of a non-Aboriginal archaeologist and historian. And with a bit of hesitation, I'm now going to try and show you a video that was created for the National Museum of Australia last year to give you a sense of Aboriginal Kamay and something to carry with you as I talk about its ancient past. So let's just give that a try and hopefully this will work. Can you see and hear that hopefully?
Nagambi, Kamay Nai, Kamango Molly, Murno, Kamay Nalayangio, Darawulawala, Mara Murnong Yagan, Nale Majang Nai, Mara Murda Wuliwa.
This is our country, Kamay, Botany Bay. Our people have been living here since time began. Our land, waterways and sky are part of what we refer to as our country. Our spirit ancestors created our country and the various life forms within it, giving us our kinship, social structures and our laws. Kamay, Botany Bay provided Gamangal, the people belonging to Botany Bay, the resources needed to thrive for many generations. Our responsibility to care for one another and our environment in a spiritual and sustainable way ensured our people not only survived but thrived. In this part of our country, you may hear and see different ways Aboriginal people identify themselves, like Guyagal, Gadagal, Bidagal, Galmagal, Darawal and Garungal. These names describe different layers of identity. Some refer to family, to the region where they were born and lived, the language they spoke, their connection to their spirit ancestors, and their cultural status they held. Our old people taught us that your language and your country go together. They cannot be separated. Our language gives our people a spiritual connection to our country, including all life forms within it. We continue to use our language to assert our ongoing connections to our country. We still describe our country by using their original names, like Botany Bay, which means water source, and is the name for the northern headland of Kamay, or Gurubal, which is where the Laperouse Aboriginal community was permanently placed 136 years ago, and means the place of the bush pigeon. We call the southern headland of Kamay Gibeah, and Gundrel is the name of the place where the crew of the HM bark Endeavour landed. Gundrel was adapted by Europeans for Cornell, which is still used today. Other local names like Tabagai, Yara, and Tara are still used by both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people around the bay. And on behalf of our people, we hope you enjoy your visit to Kamay.
Well, I'll put a link to that that video at the end with some other things from the same website, which hopefully you'll find of interest. About 10 years ago, I went camping with my family out to far western New South Wales along the Barker, the Darling River, and it was flowing at that time. I took this photo of one of the lakes at Menindee. They've had their flows controlled by weirs that were built in the 1950s. One of the consequences is that the trees that used to live there have died, and when it floods, like in this photo, It creates quite a strange sight of these dead trees poking up through the water. What's this got to do with Kamay 1,000 kilometres away? Well, you'll see in a minute. Now, I've only got less than 20 minutes to cover 20,000 years, so I better get started with a bit of time travel. About 20,000 years ago, there was a global ice age. You might be imagining mammoths and glaciers, and certainly some parts of the northern hemisphere had these, but not in Sydney. Here there was no ice. The temperature was a few degrees colder, but still, Sydney was a completely different form to today, shaped by that ice age. Glaciers around the world had sucked up and stored a big part of the ocean. This meant that the seas around the world were much lower than they are today. In Sydney, they were about 100 metres lower. That means that anywhere today where the water is less than 100 metres deep, which is all of Sydney Harbour and all of Kamay for a start, was dry land back then. The actual ocean was many kilometres further east than today, as you can see on this map. I put this together from the detailed research of others on the bottom of the ocean and the bay. By measuring how deep the water is now, you can see what would have been dry land back then. You can also trace the lines of creeks and rivers that once flowed across that land but are now drowned by the water. So you can see today's coastline in grey outlined, and everything that's green was dry land 20,000 years ago, with the blue creeks running through to the ocean several kilometres further to the east. This shows you what Kamay, or rather pre-Kamay, looked like. The rocky cliffs of Kurnell and La Perouse headlands existed, but they weren't lapped by waves like they are today. If you looked to the east from these rocky hills, you couldn't see the ocean. Instead, you would have looked out across a massive flat plain covered by forests, with rivers running across it to the ocean far off in the distance. If you turned around, instead of seeing the bay, you would have seen a swampy sand plain. You could have walked across this, occasionally crossing a creek or river, and if you got thirsty on the way, you could have just drunk the water because this was all fresh water, not salty. If you went a bit further north to Sydney Harbour and walked down to the end of Bennelong Point, where the Opera House now is, it would have been like standing at one of those amazing lookouts in the Blue Mountains. You would have been on the edge of a ridge looking down over a huge forested valley with a river at the bottom, winding its way to the east. Back at Kamay, let's think about the rivers we all know, the Cooks and Georges rivers. As you can see, they were pretty different too. The Cooks River flowed south across the swampy plain, flanked by sand dunes. It met the Georges River in the middle of what's now Kurnell, and then met the Hacking River near what's now Cronulla, before flowing out to the sea. And this was a freshwater river for most of its length, not the tidal rivers that we know today. When the Kamay area looked like this, Aboriginal people had already been living in the Sydney region for hundreds of generations. This was their country and they knew it intimately. But it was also about to change massively. Around 18,000 years ago, the world began to emerge from the Ice Age and things began to change. As temperatures rose, so did the oceans as the glaciers sent melting water back into the sea. For the next 10,000 years, the coastal plain that you can see on this map was eaten up by a metre or two at a time by the rising waters. And this is where my Menindee picture comes back in. Let's imagine what those rising seas would have looked like. 1 or 2 metres per year means that in your lifetime, 50 to 100 metres of land disappeared. The forests on that land would have been drowned. So for most of Sydney's history since that ice age, we didn't have stretches of sandy beaches looking out onto an endless blue ocean that we know today. Standing on the shore, you probably would have been looking at something like these vast expanses of dead trees. And think about what that would have been like for Aboriginal people. The ground literally would have shifted beneath their feet, and this continued for hundreds of generations. Disappearing land would have been normal. It would have been all that anyone alive had ever known, that constant disappearing of the shoreline. The idea of a shoreline staying still that we take for granted today probably would have seemed absurd. The rising seas gradually began to create the Sydney that we recognise today. Kamay began to form like a massive bathtub, slowly filling up as water came through the heads. The ancient Cooks and Georges River channel that headed through to the south was cut off as sand was pushed ashore to form the sandy Kurnell Peninsula. These rivers became tidal rivers, flowing into the north and south end of the bay as we see them in this picture. By around 7,000 years ago, the bay had taken its approximate current form, that is, minus the airport and Port Botany, which you can see outlined in white there just to help you figure out where you are. Aboriginal people lived around the bay as these changes were happening, and here I've shown you a couple of the more ancient Aboriginal places. It's a misleading map though, because there were a number of changes that happened over the last 7,000 years that I'll explain a bit later. The oldest site that we know about so far around the bay was found during the construction of apartments at Walleye Creek. It was a fireplace that was found to be about 10,500 years old. When Aboriginal people sat around that fire, the Cooks River was still a freshwater river and the bay was still only partly formed. A couple of thousand years later, Aboriginal people were camped around another fireplace where the Prince of Wales Hospital now stands at Randwick. This was situated in a massive field of dunes, which you can still sense when you drive past the University of New South Wales, Randwick Racecourse and the hospital. These dunes are tens of metres deep, and you can definitely feel going up and down in those areas that that's what you're driving across. Between those dunes were swamps, and Aboriginal people caught fish in those swamps. Now this hearth that you can see pictured here with Mary Dallas, an archaeologist on the left, and Uncle David Ingray on the right, was found in 1995 when the remains of a cemetery were being removed above this in the dunes. When they kept digging down, some sharp-eyed archaeologists found those hearthstones. What's really incredible is that they were able to date how old that hearth was from sand grains around the hearth. There's a technique that archaeologists use which can tell you how long it is since sand grains have been exposed to light. And from that, they could tell that the hearth had been there 8,500 years ago. And even more than that, just this small hearth was able to yield something really interesting and personal. There was residues of fat spattered around on the stones, and microscopic analysis of those found that they were fat from freshwater fish. So suddenly we could see just from looking at those stones that 8,500 years ago, Aboriginal people were camped here cooking fish that they'd caught in the swamps. When they were here, the peninsula between the bay and the ocean was shrinking because the sea was still rising. Botany Bay hadn't quite reached its current form. And these are just two of many hundreds or thousands of places that Aboriginal people used at different times when the environment was changing like this. These deep dunes are still there under roads and buildings all around the bay and most of the eastern suburbs, and more traces of this ancient past continues to be found. Now, I mentioned that the sea reached its current level about 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, but it didn't stop there. Over the next few thousand years, the sea rose and fell a few more times. On at least one occasion, around 6,000 years ago, it rose 1 or 2 metres higher than today. Kamay got even bigger. It spread across the low-lying areas to the north, extending across what's now Sydney Airport, maybe as far up as Moore Park. Into these shallow waters swam a dugong, which Aboriginal people killed and butchered. These bones with cut marks that you can see on the left hand, on your right hand side there, were found when workmen were digging Alexandra Canal in the 1890s. They were found many metres below the ground in the mud. And that's the canal that runs along the western edge of Sydney Airport at Tempe. They also found buried tree stumps that showed that there must have been times when the environment was very different. It was big news because until then, non-Aboriginal people assumed that Aboriginal people had only lived in Australia for a very short time, and they also assumed that the landscape had never changed from what they could see. This was the first clue that Kamay had an ancient history, whole landscapes that once existed and were now buried metres underground. But they also realised that Aboriginal people had lived in these ancient landscapes. Back then, they had no way to know how long ago this was, but in 2004, radiocarbon dating of the dugong bones showed that they were 6,000 years old. By about 3,000 years ago, the sea level stabilised, Aboriginal people camped on this shoreline and fished the bay. The remains of their camps still survive in many places, along with rock engravings and other traces of their use. Many of them are still there, and to protect them, I've not shown where they are. But in addition to those we know about, there are also many more that lie hidden beneath the sands. Sometimes these come to light. For example, workmen digging trenches at Sanssouci nearly 100 years ago found axes, shells, and human remains from campsites a metre or more below the ground. And so, and during the construction of Walleye Creek Apartments about 15 years ago, the fireplace I mentioned was found, also quite a long way beneath the ground. The reason these have survived is partly because the houses and other structures built around the bay over the last 200 years have not mostly dug that deep into the sand. They've sat on top of the sand. But these days we're building more and more things, and we're digging deeper and building bigger, digging through those sands for the first time in many cases. We need to be very careful that we don't discover this unique and ancient history while we're in the process of destroying it, because then it will truly be gone forever. Some councils around the bay, such as Sutherland, have tried to address this by putting in place procedures to make sure that Aboriginal sites like these are investigated before developments happen. But most of Kamay is sadly still not covered by procedures like this. But back to the shifting shoreline. Even though sea levels had stopped changing by about 3,000 years ago, the shoreline was still not fully formed. The big wetlands of Towra Point and Quibre Bay, you can see on the southern side of the bay there, only formed around 1,000 years ago. These wetlands created rich fishing grounds for Aboriginal people, and some of the biggest and best preserved Aboriginal sites around the bay are found along this old shore at Kurnell. Sydney's history is often discussed as though it started when Cook and the Endeavour arrived in Kamay 250 years ago. Clearly, that's completely wrong, because Aboriginal people had been living in Sydney for thousands of generations by that time. But because of this fixation on Cook and the First Fleet and colonial history in Sydney, we've also come to see the land they described more than 200 years ago as being the real Kamay, the real Sydney, because it's familiar with us today. But this is also wrong, because the environment has changed so much, and this latest version of Kamay has only been around for a very short amount of time. Consider what this map made by Cook in 1770 would have looked like if he'd sailed in 1,000 years earlier. Towra Point at the southern end of the bay wouldn't have existed, and the whole southern shore would have looked quite different. What would it have looked like 6,000 years ago when the bay was much bigger than it is today? And what would it have looked like 10,000 years ago when he couldn't even sail the boat in because the bay didn't exist? Cook saw and described Aboriginal people everywhere around the bay, but he was ignorant about the massive environmental changes of the bay, and they were also ignorant about the ancient and deep Aboriginal connections to the place. When the First Fleet arrived 18 years later and invaded the lands of coastal Sydney people, they ignored and were not interested in these connections. And as the colony grew, Aboriginal people faded out of the history books. But they never left the bay. They've always been here, even if their presence has been ignored. Some of their ancient campsites continued to be used, as we can see from glass and metal tools sometimes mixed into them. And Aboriginal people living around the bay told the names of some of the places to early surveyors, like you can see in this 1827 map of Kurnell. These names still survive 200 years later, as you heard in that video clip. Kurnell, Towra, Cronulla, Woolooware, Weenie, all of these names are still used. And as well, the descendants of the people who lived in these places still survive. In other cases, Aboriginal people have fought to have traditional names reinstated, like Kamay itself. The Aboriginal people who lived around Kamay in the 19th century found new ways to live in the growing city of Sydney. They still connected with their traditional country, its lands and waters, and still spoke their language and practiced customs. Things were lost and they adapted, but they did so from the basis of this deep connection, a connection that partly was forged by their ancestors having witnessed the very formation of the landscape in which they lived. By the end of the 19th century, most Aboriginal people around Sydney had come to live at Gurrawal, La Perouse. Over the past century, these people have witnessed the most recent changes to the bay, as the bay floor has been dredged to build runways and ports, and the whole course of the Cooks River has changed. These changes were rapid, drastic and man-made, but just as before, Aboriginal people have lived through these changes, and they still live around Kamay. That story is not mine to tell, but I highly recommend that you check out these two websites. The top one is made for the 100th anniversary of Sydney Airport last year and has a lot of content about some of the Aboriginal sites and Aboriginal people who've lived around the bay. And the bottom one was from a National Museum exhibition last year about the 250th anniversary of Cook, and tells the story of that encounter from an Aboriginal perspective. So I recommend that you explore those two and learn more about the Aboriginal connections to this amazing place. And that's all I've got to say, so thank you for listening.